The salesman didn't even look up from his clipboard when the '67 Dodge pickup rolled into the lot. Faded turquoise paint, primer spots on both fenders, exhaust pipe wired on with coat hangers. The kind of truck that said barely making it in every county from Watertown to Pierre. Curtis Lindbergh stepped out. Coveralls worn white at the knees. Work boots with electrical tape, holding the left sole. He was 52 years old, looked 60, and carried himself like a man who'd just driven 8 hours because he had business to conduct. The salesman, kid couldn't have been 30, wearing a polyester suit that cost more than Curtis's entire wardrobe, finally glanced up. His expression went from bored to dismissive in half a second. Help you find something? Tone that said, we both know you can't afford what's here. Curtis nodded toward the implement lot behind the showroom. Come to look at iron. Looking's free. The kid went back to his clipboard. This was Hartman Implement in Huron, South Dakota, April 1974. The biggest farm equipment dealership between Sioux Falls and Aberdeen. 42 tractors on the lot. 17 combines. Tillage equipment lined up like soldiers on parade. International Harvester red. Everywhere you looked. Curtis walked past the showroom. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for an escort. The salesman watched him go, then turned to the parts manager leaning in the doorway. Think he's good for a set of planter discs? If he pays cash. They both laughed. What they didn't know, what nobody in Huron knew yet, was that Curtis Lindbergh had 3 grain bins on his place outside, Highmore stuffed with wheat he'd refused to sell for 18 months. Wheat he'd planted in spring of '72 when everyone said he was crazy to put in that much. Wheat he'd harvested in '72 when prices were nothing special and his neighbors were hauling straight to the elevator. Curtis had kept his wheat in the bin, watched prices, waited, then the Russians came shopping. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what happened in American agriculture between July 1972 and spring 1974, because this wasn't just Curtis's story. This was the biggest commodity boom in modern agricultural history, and it caught almost everyone by surprise. In July 1972, the Soviet Union approached the USDA with a problem: crop failures. They needed grain, a lot of grain. The USDA facilitated sales. Between July and September '72, the USSR bought up over 440 million bushels of American wheat, nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. crop. The deals were done quietly, negotiated through Continental Grain Company, Cargill, and other major trading houses. Most farmers had already sold at pre-announcement prices. Wheat that had been trading at $1.33 a bushel in June 1972 hit $2.42 by September. By December '73, it touched $4.50. By February 1974, right when Curtis Lindbergh was driving that rusty Dodge toward Huron, wheat was trading at $5.89 a bushel on the Chicago Board of Trade. The farmers who'd sold early made nothing special. The farmers who'd held grain made fortunes. Curtis Lindbergh had 46,000 bushels in those 3 bins. Had borrowed against them twice when operating money got tight. Had watched his neighbors laugh at him for not selling when wheat was at $3. Take your profit, Curtis. Market never goes up forever. He hadn't sold. At $5.80 a bushel, those bins represented roughly $267,000 in 1974 money, before you account for storage fees, hauling, and production notes he still owed at First National Bank of Highmore. But Curtis Lindbergh was about to have the single biggest cash year of his 43 years of farming, and he needed equipment. He walked the implement lot methodically, stopped at a 1466 International, turbocharged, 146 horsepower, hydrostatic transmission that was causing debates in every coffee shop in the state. Some guys swore by hydrostatic. Others said it was too complicated. Wait for the bugs to get worked out. Curtis checked the hour meter. For hours. Demo unit. He opened the cab door, looked at the interior. Air conditioning. AM/FM radio. Buddy seat. This wasn't his father's tractor. Price tag and window. $18,450. He moved on. Found the combine row. 3 915 Internationals. These were the previous year's model. Before the rotary revolution, everyone saw coming. Conventional machines. Corn head and grain head packages. The 915 could handle a 13-foot header in wheat. Push through 100 acres a day if conditions were right. Curtis knew the specs. He'd studied farm equipment, catalogs the way some men studied racing forms. The 915 ran a 135 horsepower diesel, had a 50-bushel grain tank, could be optioned with grain monitor, new technology that let you see your yield in real time. Farmers were split on whether that was useful or just something else to break down. Price tag on the one he was examining. $22,100 with both heads. He was writing numbers on a scrap of paper from his pocket when the young salesman finally wandered over. "That's a nice machine," the kid said. Tone hadn't improved. "Course, you're looking at over $22,000 there. Plus you want to finance, which at current rates." "What's your name?" Curtis interrupted. Brad Hensley." "Well, Brad, I'm not looking to finance anything. I'm looking to buy. Cash." Brad's expression didn't change much. He'd heard this before from farmers who wanted to feel important. Walked a lot, talk big, then finance a used disc or drive away empty. "Cash is great," Brad said. "What exactly are you looking to purchase?" Curtis folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. 3 machines. Tractor, combine, and a 12-row planter. International across the board. And I'll need them delivered to Highmore by the end of the month, because I'm planning the 15th of May whether this equipment's there or not. Brad actually smiled. "Sir, you're talking about—" "I know what I'm talking about. You want to sell me something, or you want to keep guessing what's in my bank account." That's when Roy Hartman himself came out of the office. Roy was 68 years old, had opened his dealership in 1947 with 2 used Farmals and a dream. Now he was moving 40 tractors a month during spring season, sending his grandkids to college, and trying to figure out how to retire without the business falling apart. He'd seen every kind of farmer there was, and something about the guy in the patched coverall standing in front of his 915 display didn't fit the usual pattern. Roy walked over. "Afternoon." Curtis nodded. "Afternoon. Roy Hartman. I own this place. Brad here treating you right." "Brad's doing fine. I was just explaining that I need 3 machines. Tractor, combine, planter. Need them delivered within 3 weeks. Roy studied Curtis. Work-worn hands. Face that had seen 40 years of wind and sun. Boots held together with tape. But the eyes were steady. No desperation. No posturing. Just a man stating requirements. "What are you farming?" Roy asked. 2,800 acres. Wheat and corn rotation. Southeast of Highmore. Been on that land since '31. That's a fair amount of ground. Where are you running now? 2 1060 SIXS. A 403 combine that's on its last legs. 8-row planter I bought in '63 that skips more than it plants anymore. Roy did the math in his head. 2,800 acres was serious. 2 1060 SX meant this guy had already invested heavy. Those that come out in '71 cost $14,000 each. Nobody bought 2 of them unless they had scale and money. "What happened to your truck?" Roy asked, nodding toward the parking lot. "Nothing happened to it. It runs fine. Gets me to town. I don't spend money on things that don't make me money." Roy smiled. He liked this answer. "Brad, why don't you get Mr. Lindbergh, Curtis Lindbergh? Why don't you get Curtis here some coffee? Real coffee, not that instant garbage. And bring the 74 pricing sheets." Roy turned back to Curtis. "You said you need delivery in 3 weeks?" "Sooner if you can, but I'm planning mid-May no matter what. So 3 weeks is my outside limit. Let's talk specifics." They walked to the office. Brad hustled ahead, looking confused but moving fast. Inside, Roy settled behind a desk that hadn't seen the top surface since 1968. Papers everywhere. Manuals. Parts catalogs. A calendar from Continental Belton Bank showing a blonde in a bikini leaning on a 4430 John Deere. Roy's son had thought that was hilarious. Roy thought it was undignified. But he kept up anyway. Curtis sat in the client chair. Didn't touch the coffee Brad brought. Just waited. Okay, Roy said. Let's start with what you need, and then we'll talk about what you can afford. Tractor first. You mentioned you're running 1,060 SIXS now. Want to stick with International? That's why I'm here. The 1466 out, there is our top model right now. Turbocharged 436 cubic inch diesel. Hydrostatic transmission. You can run that tractor from 0 to 24 miles per hour without shifting. It's at 146 PTO horsepower. Cab comes standard now. Air conditioning is extra, but I'd recommend it. You're going to be in that seat 60 hours a week during season. I've done the research. What's the price? Loaded the way you want it. Cab, air radio, buddy seat, 3-point hitch, drawbar, front weights. You're at $21,300. Curtis didn't blink. Combined, the 915 is solid. We've sold 18 of them in the last 6 months. But I'll be straight with you. The 1460 is coming next year. Rotary design. Totally different animal. If you can wait. I can't wait. I need to be cutting wheat in July. 915 will work. It'll work fine. With corn head, grain head, 30-foot header for wheat, all the safeties and monitors. $24, $800. Planter. Roy pulled out a different catalog. 12-row, you said? Corn. Row spacing at 30 inches. Need monitor systems, insecticide boxes, fertilizer attachments. Full setup. The 800 series planter with everything you're describing runs about $8,900. Curtis was doing math on his scrap paper. Brad was standing in the corner, trying to look casual but watching every second of this. Curtis looked up. Total, $55,000, round numbers. That's before any trade, before delivery fees, before we talk about extended warranties or... I'll pay $52,000. Cash. You deliver all 3 to my place before May 10th. You've got a deal. No trade. I'll keep my old equipment for backup. The room got very quiet. Roy Hartman had been selling farm equipment for 27 years. He'd seen big deals before, but this was different. This was a guy who'd driven up in a pickup held together with rust and hope, wearing coveralls his wife had probably patched 5 times, asking for a cash deal that would be Roy's biggest single sale of the year. Curtis, Roy said carefully, I believe you're serious, but you're talking about putting down $52,000. I need to know you can actually do that before I start moving equipment. Curtis reached into his coverall pocket, pulled out a folded envelope, handed it across the desk. Roy opened it. Inside was a letter from First National Bank of Highmore, dated 3 days prior. It confirmed that Curtis Lindbergh held grain storage loans against 46,000 bushels of wheat, current market value approximately $267,000, and that upon sale of said grain, proceeds after loan repayment would exceed $240,000. The bank verified that Curtis had been a customer in good standing since 1951, and that funds for proposed equipment purchase were available. Roy read it twice, looked up at Curtis. You held wheat from 72? Yep. You held it through all of 73? Yep. Even when it hit $3. For even then, Roy Hartman started laughing. Not mockery, pure admiration. You magnificent bastard. You held through the Russian deal when everyone else was selling into it. Curtis shrugged. Seemed like the thing to do. Brad, Roy said, still grinning. Get the contract paperwork. 3 machines. Custom order. Delivery before May 10th. He turned back to Curtis. We'll do it for 52 even. I'll eat the delivery fee. Hell, I'll bring them out personally just to see the place. Curtis nodded. Appreciate it. Can I ask you something? Roy said, why'd you drive up here in that truck? You could have bought a new one 6 months ago. Didn't need a new truck 6 months ago. Still don't. The Dodge runs fine. But the way you got treated, I got treated exactly like I expected. Young Brad out there made some assumptions. That's okay. I've made assumptions in my life too. Doesn't change what I need or what I can pay. Roy looked at Curtis Lindbergh and saw something he didn't see often anymore. A farmer who understood that farming wasn't about looking successful. It was about being successful when it counted. They shook hands. Curtis left a deposit check, $20,000, drawn on First National Bank of Highmore. Roy walked him out to the parking lot. Brad was standing by the rusty Dodge, looking like someone had just explained quantum physics to him in Pig Latin. "Mr. Lindbergh," Brad said as Curtis approached, "I apologize for—" Curtis waved him off. "Nothing to apologize for. You did your job. I looked like a guy browsing for used parts. That's not your fault." He climbed into the Dodge. Fired up on the second try. Starter had been acting up lately, but he'd get to it eventually. Drove out of the lot the same way he'd driven in. Roy and Brad stood watching him go. "Boss," Brad finally said, "how did that just happen?" "That," Roy said, "is what happens when someone understands the difference between farming and spending." Now, here's what you need to understand about the period we're talking about. The 1972 to 1974 commodity boom didn't create wealth evenly. According to USDA data analyzed later, about 8% of grain farmers held significant quantities past the initial Russian purchases. Most sold immediately, taking the first price spike as a win. The farmers who held longer made extraordinary returns, but they also took extraordinary risk. If prices had collapsed, those storage loans would have bankrupted them. Curtis Lindbergh wasn't a speculator. He was a farmer who'd read the signs. Global grain stocks were at historic lows. The Soviet Union had structural agricultural problems, and U.S. export policy was shifting. The Federal Reserve's own agricultural lending reports from late 1973 noted that some farm operations were experiencing unprecedented cash positions, but warned that such conditions should not be considered typical or sustainable. Curtis was experiencing one of those unprecedented years. And unlike many farmers who take that windfall and celebrate, Curtis was doing what his father had taught him in the Depression: turn cash into productive capacity. The 3 machines he just ordered represented about 20% of his grain sale proceeds. The rest would pay down long-term debt, fund 2 years of operating expenses, and finally get that site expansion he'd been planning since '69. But more importantly, those 3 machines would increase his efficiency by roughly 40%. The 1466 could pull bigger implements faster. The 915 could harvest more acres per day with less grain loss. The 12-row planter could cover his corn ground in half the time, letting him plant in optimal windows rather than dragging it out for 3 weeks. Curtis Lindbergh wasn't buying toys. He was buying time. And in farming, time was everything. The machines arrived on May 7th. Roy Hartman brought them personally, driving the 1466 himself with the combine and planter loaded on lowboys behind. Curtis's wife Helen made coffee. Their 2 sons, both farming nearby sections, came over to see. The 1466 sat in the yard, international red gleaming in the afternoon sun. Curtis walked around it 3 times before he climbed into the cab. The interior smelled like new vinyl and hydraulic oil. He settled into the seat, adjusted the mirrors, reached for the gear selector. No, wait, hydrostatic. Hand lever on the right. Forward for go, back for stop, twist for speed. He fired it up. That turbocharged diesel caught immediately, settled into a smooth idle that his 1060 SXS could never match. He eased the hand lever forward. The tractor moved. No lurching, no grabbing, just smooth, progressive acceleration. He brought it up to walking speed, stopped, reversed, stopped again. Helen was watching from the porch, caught his eye, gave him a small nod. He shut it down, climbed out. Roy was standing nearby with the paperwork. "Everything look right?" Roy asked. "It does." They handled the final paperwork at the kitchen table. Balance due, $32,000. Curtis wrote the check without hesitation. It was the single largest check he'd ever written. Didn't feel good, didn't feel bad, just felt necessary. Roy packed up the contracts, shook hands with Curtis and Helen both. "You need anything, you call. Parts, service, questions, we're here. Appreciate it." After Roy left, Curtis went back outside. His boys were examining the combine. "Dad," his older son Mark said, "this thing is going to rip through wheat." "That's the idea. Where are you going to trade that piece of shit Dodge? his younger son David asked, grinning. Curtis looked at the pickup. Rust, primer, tape on the boots, exhaust wired on. When it stops running, that's ridiculous. You just dropped 52 grand on equipment. You can afford a new truck. Sure I can, but the truck works. These machines make me money. Truck just hauls me around. Priorities. Mark and David exchanged looks. Their dad had always been like this. Spend on production, save on everything else. They'd grown up with lunches packed in bread bags and wearing jeans until they had holes. But they'd also grown up on paid for land, with equipment that worked and an operation that survived when neighbors went under. Now I want to ask you something, because this gets at the heart of what happened in the mid-'70s. Curtis Lindbergh made what looked like an amazing timing call. Hold wheat to the Russian deal. Sell at the peak. Use the windfall to upgrade equipment. Smart, right? But here's the complicated truth. Curtis got lucky. Skill was involved. He recognized undervalued grain. He had the nerve to hold against conventional wisdom. He understood storage economics. But he also got lucky that the Russians bought when they did. Lucky that the embargo didn't happen until later. Lucky that prices spiked instead of collapsing. Thousands of farmers tried the same play and went bankrupt because they guessed wrong on timing. The 1970s taught a brutal lesson. Commodity farming rewards skill and punishes everyone. Sometimes in the same year, Curtis's neighbor, a guy named Ernie Schroeder, had also held wheat. But Ernie had borrowed against that wheat to buy land at inflated prices in 1973. When interest rates started climbing in 74 and 75, Ernie's debt service ate all his grain profits. He was forced to sell in 1977 when wheat dropped below $3. Lost everything. Same strategy. Different outcome. That was the 70s. Curtis Lindbergh planted his corn on May 14th with a new 12-row International. Finished in 4 days instead of the usual 9. Got every seed in optimal soil temperature and moisture. Emergence was 97%. He cut his wheat in mid-July with the 915. The machine performed exactly as advertised. Fast, efficient, minimal grain loss. He harvested 800 acres in 6 days. His old 403 would have taken 11, and he'd have lost bushels to shatter and weather delays. By September, Curtis had sold his entire grain crop at respectable prices. Not peak like 74, but solid. He'd paid his operating notes. He'd banked money for next year's inputs. And that rusty Dodge was still sitting in the yard, still running, still hauling Curtis to town when he needed parts. The story got around. People talked about it at the co-op, at the diner in Highmore, at the farmers' union meetings. You hear about Curtis Lindbergh? Drove that ratty pickup into Hartman's place. Bought 50 grand worth of iron, paid cash. Some people thought it was impressive. Others thought it was showing off. Curtis didn't care much either way. What he cared about was this. Those 3 machines gave him operational efficiency he'd never had before. They let him farm his ground properly instead of just surviving it. They reduced his weather risk by shrinking his planting and harvest windows. They turned his operation from marginal to sustainable. And when the farm crisis hit in the early 80s, when land values collapsed, when interest rates hit 20%, when half the farmers in South Dakota went bankrupt, Curtis Lindbergh was still there, still farming, still driving that goddamn rusty Dodge. Because he'd learned something in the 70s that a lot of farmers didn't learn until it was too late. Looking poor isn't the same as being poor. And looking rich isn't the same as surviving. The equipment lasted. The 1466 ran until 1989, when Curtis's son Mark finally convinced him to upgrade. 23,000 hours on the meter. The 915 cut wheat until 1987, when parts became too hard to find and the rotary combines had proven their worth. The planter ran until the early 90s, when population genetics and planting technology had evolved beyond what 12-row mechanics could handle. Curtis kept every receipt, maintenance logs, hour meters, parts orders. He could tell you exactly what those machines cost him over their operational lives. Could tell you the return on investment down to the decimal. He sold the Dodge in 1981, not because it stopped running, Because the floor finally rusted through so bad that Helen refused to ride in it anymore. Safety issue, she said. Curtis agreed. He bought a used 76 Ford F-150 with 90,000 miles on it for $1,500. Finally upgrading? The guy at the truck lot asked. Nope, Curtis said. Just replacing. That's the story. Guy drives into a dealership looking like he can't afford a fan belt. Walks out having bought $52,000 worth of equipment. Cash on the barrel. People remember him for the rusty truck and the surprised looks from the salesman. But that's not really the story. The real story is about a farmer who understood that success in agriculture isn't about impressing anyone. It's about allocating resources correctly. Production first, appearance never. The 1970s created a lot of wealthy-looking farmers. They drove new pickups, wore clean clothes to town, talked big at the coffee shop. By 1985, most of them were gone. Curtis Lindbergh is still there, 94 years old now, living in Highmore, son's running the operation. The land's been in the family since 1931. Will be there after Curtis is gone. All because a guy in coveralls held together with electrical tape knew the difference between farming and performing. So here's my question for everyone watching who farmed in the 70s or knows someone who did. What was the moment you realized that appearances didn't matter? That the guy in the newest truck wasn't necessarily the guy who'd survive? Tell me in the comments. Because the people who lived through this era learned lessons that still apply today. About debt, about timing, about the difference between wealth and sustainability. This channel exists to preserve the real history of American agriculture, not the mythology, not the nostalgia. The actual economics, the actual decisions, the actual consequences. If you think stories like Curtis Lindbergh's matter, stories about farmers who got it right not because they were smarter, but because they understood what farming actually required, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because these lessons didn't die with the 1970s. They're just as relevant now, when farmers are making decisions about $250,000 combines and $500,000 tractors. Every story here is researched, fact-checked, and told with respect for the people who lived it. The economics are real. The equipment specs are real. The prices are real. The only things that change are names and specific locations. But the stories themselves? Those happened. Maybe not exactly like this, but close enough that anyone who was there would recognize the truth in them. Curtis Lindbergh understood something fundamental. Farming is a business, not a performance. The sooner you learn that, the better your chances of survival. He learned it early, practiced it his whole life, and when the boom turned to bust, as it always does, he was ready. That rusty Dodge, it's parked in a shed on the family land. Curtis won't let anyone scrap it. Says it reminds him of what matters.